Cleveland was not on my radar this week. I want to be upfront about that. I had other teams lined up, other storylines I was already deep into, and honestly, the Browns have spent so much of the last 2 years buried under the weight of the Deshaun Watson situation and everything orbiting it that I had mentally placed them in the category of teams I would get to when the more urgent conversations cleared. Then I sat down with the minicamp footage, and something happened that almost never happens when I'm working through early offseason clips. I stopped mid-rep, rewound, and watched it again. Then I cleared everything else off my board and spent the next 2 hours on nothing but Cleveland. Because what I was watching did not feel like the carefully packaged content organizations push out to feed their media cycle. It felt like something being built, something with internal coherence and organizational intention behind it. And by the time I finished, I was sitting with a thought I genuinely was not prepared for. The most important story developing in the AFC North right now might not be happening in Baltimore or Cincinnati. It might be happening in Berea, Ohio, assembled one practice rep at a time. Let me tell you exactly what I saw and why it matters more than the national conversation is currently crediting. Before I get into specifics, I want to give you the honest frame for interpreting minicamp footage because I think most coverage either overstates what these sessions can tell you or dismisses them entirely. And both responses miss the point. Helmets and shorts. No live pass rush. No defensive back competing for a roster spot with the authentic desperation that genuinely tests a receiver's concentration at the top of a route. The competitive pressure is real, but managed, controlled in ways that August training camp absolutely will not be. Anyone handing you definitive conclusions about NFL readiness from 3 days of controlled walkthroughs is selling something you should not buy. But here is what minicamp does reveal, and this is the part that gets consistently underappreciated. It exposes the invisible work. The months of private preparation that happened in empty gyms and quiet practice fields before any camera was rolling. That kind of preparation announces itself on day one with a clarity that is almost impossible to hide, whether the player intends to advertise it or not. The readiness is visible. It is always visible. And in Cleveland this week, it was visible in ways that stopped me cold. Start with Denzel Boston. I want to spend real time here because I believe the gap between what the minicamp footage actually showed and what most national coverage has given him is wide enough to be a genuine analytical problem. The physical profile announces itself the moment the clips begin. Long, large, filling the outside receiver position with a physical authority that this Cleveland offense has been quietly missing for a stretch of time, long enough that most observers have stopped registering the absence as a structural problem. It has just become background noise, an accepted limitation baked into how people think about this offense's ceiling. The Josh Gordon comparison started circulating almost immediately once people got a look at him, and the instinct behind those comparisons is honest. A boundary receiver who physically imposes himself on a route rather than simply running one. A perimeter target who forces defensive coordinators to make real coverage allocation decisions rather than allowing them to react comfortably to whatever the offense presents. A presence that demands genuine respect rather than the soft shade corners can afford when they don't truly fear a receiver. Boston's physical profile addresses that specific and real absence in a way that deserves clear acknowledgement rather than a footnote. But here is where I need you to stay with me, because the physical description is not actually the story, and I refuse to let this get reduced to a size evaluation. The routes are the story. What Boston was doing in his route running during those mini-camp sessions is being discussed in a single evaluative sentence in most coverage, and it deserves considerably more than that. He was not winning in those drills on raw size. He was not pushing defensive backs around with his frame and manufacturing separation through physical advantage the way a player still learning the position would. What he was demonstrating, at a stage of development where his technical refinement is still being actively constructed, was genuine route intelligence that should not exist yet at this level of experience. He was establishing positional leverage before his breaks, rather than scrambling for it after the defensive back had already responded to his movement. He was setting alignment tendencies in his release stems early in a practice session and then executing cuts in direct contradiction to what he had been showing coverage all morning. He was reading pre-snap coverage rotations and making en route adjustments in a way that marks the difference between a receiver who understands what this position demands professionally and an athletic profile who is still discovering what the position fundamentally is. Route sophistication at that level does not arrive at a professional evaluation from nowhere. It is not installed by a coaching staff across 3 days of walkthrough sessions while names are still being memorized. That kind of technical foundation gets built through months of deliberate, solitary preparation, empty facilities, private coaching relationships, repetition after repetition in environments where nothing is being filmed and nothing is being rewarded except the player's own reckoning with what his opportunity requires. Boston walked into Cleveland minicamp with that construction already completed, and it was visible the way genuine preparation is always visible on day one because it cannot hide itself regardless of how controlled the setting is. For Shedeur Sanders, the practical implications of this are concrete rather than speculative. The most persistent structural constraint on this offense has been the absence of a perimeter receiver who earns enough defensive respect to force genuine coverage commitment on the outside. That absence has been limiting play-calling freedom, third down conversion options, and what becomes available in the fourth quarter when every defensive coordinator in the league already knows where the ball tends to go. Boston's combination of physical presence and emerging route sophistication, alongside Shedeur's documented precision and willingness to attack tight windows, creates a coverage problem this offense has not been capable of generating in years. That is not projection. That is an assessment of what the minicamp footage showed and what it means structurally for the offense being assembled around this quarterback. Now, Concepcion, and I am giving you both sides of this honestly, because the comfortable version of this evaluation and the accurate version diverge in ways that require full disclosure. The drops were a real problem, and I am not going to soften that by wrapping it in minicamp context, because drops in professional football are not simply statistical negatives that get erased at the end of a practice session. They are psychological events with operational consequences that extend well beyond the individual play. Every uncaught, catchable ball deposits friction into the working relationship between a quarterback and a receiver. Friction that does not simply dissolve between snaps, that quietly shapes play-calling decisions in ways that never appear explicitly on a game plan, that slowly erodes the operational trust a quarterback must carry in a target to throw to him when the window is tight and the game outcome is genuinely at stake. Concepcion's hands have to become significantly more reliable. That is the primary developmental challenge directly in front of him right now, and saying anything less clear than that serves no one. But collapsing the entire Concepcion evaluation into the drops conversation is its own analytical failure, and I will not do it. The route tape demands a separate and honest accounting, the way he was already processing his release off the line of scrimmage, the movement concepts he was applying through the stems of his routes before his breaks arrived, the quickness he was generating at the top of his cuts, genuine, sharp quickness, not telegraphed movement that defensive backs can key and time. There was a touchdown connection in those sessions where he created separation through correct route execution and designed timing, not through athleticism, not by outrunning the defensive back, but by making the route concept function exactly as it was designed to function against the coverage he had read pre-snap. That distinction is enormous in terms of projecting a player's professional ceiling. Getting open because a route worked correctly is a fundamentally different statement about a player than getting open because he was faster than the man covering him. The first tells you the football intelligence is developing at real pace. The second tells you the player is athletic. What Concepcion showed fell clearly and consistently into the first category. His feet are already doing things that give the coaching staff genuine material to develop. The hands need to arrive at the same standard as everything else. That is the work ahead. But work built on top of a legitimate technical foundation is a meaningfully different situation from drops sitting on top of nothing, and that distinction matters when projecting what this player becomes. Let me address Taron Green directly and plainly. because I can feel the direction certain corners of this coverage want to push his minicamp moments before that narrative gathers momentum it has not earned. The arm talent is real, the mobility and improvisation dimension he brings to a position that traditional pocket passers structurally cannot provide is real. The physical presence he brought to those early sessions generated genuine excitement that deserves acknowledgement without qualification. And alongside all of that, because honest evaluation means holding both things simultaneously, the mechanical release carries a looseness and a length to it that will require sustained, patient refinement to hold up consistently against live professional pass rush pressure. He overthrew a tight end. He sailed throws past their intended targets in multiple separate sequences. None of this is particularly surprising, and none of it should be treated as alarming. Green was a sixth-round selection specifically because the ceiling is attached to an extended developmental timeline, and his current floor is precisely where sixth-round developmental quarterbacks tend to sit at the beginning of their professional lives. That is a description of reality, not a condemnation of a player. But I want to be completely direct here because I can feel where this is heading in certain coverage spaces, and it needs to be addressed without diplomatic softening. An encouraging throw in a no-contact walkthrough session does not reopen any meaningful conversation about the starting quarterback position in Cleveland. Not slightly. Not in any direction. Green's physical tools are interesting, and his development over time as a backup option may produce something worth tracking. But a sixth-round developmental quarterback still in the process of translating raw physical gifts into consistent professional-level execution is not entering any legitimate conversation about the starting role on a franchise that has embedded its entire organizational identity and hundreds of millions of dollars in resource decisions into a different quarterback. Shedeur Sanders is who Cleveland is constructing this offense around. That is not a talking point. It is encoded in every significant decision this franchise has made since the offseason began. One promising minicamp rep in a padless, no-contact setting does not alter a single element of that architecture. Here is where I want to spend the most time, because this is genuinely the largest story coming out of Cleveland minicamp and the one least likely to receive the attention it deserves. Stop examining the individual pieces and look at the organizational logic that connects all of them. Because when you step back and look at the construction as a whole, rather than as a collection of separate player evaluations, something becomes visible that individual assessments cannot capture on their own. Boston directly addresses the boundary receiver absence that has quietly placed a ceiling on this offense for years, not as a projection based on potential, but as an identifiable physical and technical profile arriving with preparation work already visible on film. Concepcion's movement qualities and route processing sophistication create coverage allocation pressure in the intermediate zones that generate precisely the kind of operating space where Shedeur has demonstrated the most comfort and the most precision. The rebuilt offensive line represents a commitment measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, invested specifically toward building the protective infrastructure a franchise quarterback needs to operate at his actual ceiling, rather than the compromised survival level and unstable front five forces on a quarterback regardless of his talent. These are not generic acquisitions dropped into generic depth chart holes with the hope that the scheme makes them coherent. These are deliberate, specific investments in an offensive vision that was architected around a particular quarterback's specific skill set and then resourced with the seriousness of an organization that genuinely believes in what it is building. That is what intentional franchise construction looks like from the inside, and it is a completely different category from the transactional roster management that teams trapped in perpetual transition tend to produce. Pieces assembled opportunistically, scheme layered on top hoping for coherence, organizational identity reconstructed from scratch every 2 or 3 years. Cleveland right now does not look like a team reacting to circumstances. It looks like a team executing a deliberate plan drawn up long before minicamp week, and the pieces arriving at this minicamp reflect that intention with unusual clarity. What the culture inside that facility is also telling us, and I think this dimension deserves explicit attention, is visible in how the players who showed up for these sessions actually showed up. The earliest days of a rookie minicamp are efficient at revealing one specific thing, that later evaluations sometimes obscure. Who arrived with their preparation already embedded in their technique, and who showed up expecting to construct their first impression in real time while the evaluation was already running. Boston's route intelligence on day one was not installed by the Cleveland coaching staff across 3 days of walkthroughs. It was built over months of solitary work in facilities where nothing was being recorded and nobody was watching, driven entirely by his own understanding of what this professional moment required. Concepcion's movement sophistication through his release patterns tells the same story about the same fundamental offseason choice. These are players who treated the months before their first professional evaluation as a serious competitive opportunity rather than a calendar gap between draft night and reporting date. That choice is visible immediately on film to anyone who has watched enough football to know the difference between players who arrived prepared and talented players who arrived confident that their talent would be sufficient. The Watson narrative has consumed its own oxygen for long enough, and its conclusion is already visible to anyone watching honestly. The trade speculation resurfaces on a media cycle that seems genuinely disconnected from any actual supporting evidence. The Tayron Green storyline that certain segments of coverage want to elevate beyond what the evaluation actually supports is not the real story. The real story is on that practice field, being written one rep at a time by receivers who showed up with preparation visible in their first route, by rookies competing with the urgency of players who understand precisely what is at stake, and by a coaching staff assembling an offense with deliberate architectural intention around a quarterback whose specific qualities those decisions are designed to serve. Not another transitional year spent managing expectations downward. Not another patient cycle while the real competitive window stays perpetually just beyond reach. A foundation being built specifically, deliberately, and with the investment decisions to back the stated ambition up with real organizational resources. The assembly is further along and moving faster than the national conversation has caught up to. Something genuine is being constructed in Cleveland, and by the time October arrives and people are scrambling to explain what they are watching, the answer will have been sitting in these minicamp clips all along, waiting for the people who stopped scrolling long enough to actually see it.